Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose. And I'm smiling because I'm sat in a different chair
You
that
do.
I insisted upon. And
Ben,
Jared's laughing at me.
Ben demanded lumbar support in this episode.
I know my rights. I've done my, whatever it's called, DSE training.
You,
well, that's just
you
play
came
screen,
in
but yeah.
you came and you kicked the podcast door and you shouted to Cordy, I demand lumbar support for this episode. And you were treated like the prima donna you were and immediately given the lumbar support you demanded.
Invited to carry this very heavy chair from the other side of the studio.
You could have pointed at a different chair and said, get that one.
I think
then.
I've picked up a back injury. That would be a part of DSE, actually, is if you injure yourself. There's a risk that you injure yourself whilst assembling your injury prevention equipment.
Yeah.
That I may have only just mitigated. We'll see. We'll see whether I can get up at the end of the episode.
Barely slid through without injury.
But anyway.
But speaking of, I don't know if I can make this. I don't know if I can make this transition. It's a massive stretch.
Speaking of renewal, and
yeah, exactly. But we want to spend this episode. It's getting late into the season. 2023 is nearing its conclusion, which means to all of our reinsurance friends, 1/1 is upon us.
Indeed.
And as we're going into the sort of the dog days of the reinsurance winter,
let's roll with it.
Let's roll with it. We want to sort of give a preview of sort of what we're seeing, what's happening, and how we see this sort of 1/1 renewal season playing out. So with that, let's dive in.
Indeed. And so let's contextualize ourselves a little bit. So we had various other seasons, renewal seasons, that either begin with a 1 if you're on one side of the pond or end in a 1 if you're on the other side of the pond. And then after the summer holidays, everybody comes back for a few major sort of reinsurance conferences spanning, Monaco, Baden-Baden, Singapore, the US, etc. Yeah. A few others as well that in other regions around the world. That apologies.
You also matter
directly. You do. You do. But then finally,
yeah,
in a week such as the one that this episode gets released on, just barely days away from Christmas and a couple of weeks, if that, away from the 1st of January date itself, we're in the frantic final preparations to make sure that those reinsurance contracts, long discussed in the many conferences beforehand, actually get closed and done on time.
Yeah. I think when you look at the comparison of this year to last year, and I think it's always helpful to sort of look at them compared to the previous year's renewals. This time last year, you had it where the retro market was very uncertain. And the retro market kind of still sorting itself out was causing a lot of sort of stress amongst the cedents about what capacity would be available to them. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty around what was going to happen around pricing and terms. And in many ways, a lot of stress that they were so far from final terms this late. I think the opposite of that is now happening this year. The market's still hard, and it's certainly not favorable for what the cedents are looking for. But at least people are going in there. There's more sort of understanding of the market. It feels to be orderly is the word we've continued to hear.
And I think as well, if you compare sort of the news stories coming out, like this time last year, we were hearing on an almost daily basis about which big carrier had to drop like the lower layer of their program in order to get it done. This was the sort of story we're hearing, whereas this year, it's more into the how long is the hard market? How much longer is this hard market going to continue lasting? But with an expectation that people who are looking to renew a deal, unless something catastrophic has happened, will be able to get it done.
Yeah,
albeit with a expected price increase.
Yeah, well, and I think because that was more well understood earlier in the year, things like additional clauses being added or taken away, or the price that would be incurred if certain things were left in, was sort of negotiated earlier. We knew that those things would come at a cost this year, and it feels like, okay, this is the trade-offs we're willing to make, and those concessions have kind of they've been made in many ways, if not on paper yet, they've been made sort of in people's mind, and they sort of come to terms with the fact that they're not going to get something that they thought they might. So I think those are all the things that are driving this renewal season forward. And for many people, it's an awareness of the importance of the data that they're bringing to the market. We talked about this at the beginning of this year and the end of last year during that renewal season. And I think those cedents that got out early and started spending more time working on data quality, they're reaping the rewards of that labor now in this period.
Yeah, I feel like we've had the perfect montage, from the end of last renewal season, where like a kind of very unfit character form at the scene has like realized the consequences. They don't meet the person they've fallen in love with, or they can't achieve the important goal that was set out at the beginning of the story arc. And so begin the montage where they, to the tune of whatever the song from Rocky is, exactly. Eye of the Tiger, there we are. I have to do lots of press-ups and pull-ups and jogging in bad weather with a sweatband on. And what that translates to in reinsurance industry terms is they've actually had to take a good hard look at how they prepare their reinsurance data.
Yeah. There are some cedents now doing their proverbial like celebratory fist pumping at the top of some stairs in Philadelphia. I should certainly know what building that is, but I don't.
I've not actually seen the films. I'm going to. It's one of many.
We're going to start a laundry list of cultural.
But some films are so culturally ubiquitous, like in other references, that it kind of feels like you'd only be watching them to fill the gaps that you haven't already kind of perceived.
Yeah.
Like, it's one of those films where it's got a spoiler like in it, a bit like the Titanic. Like everyone knows what's going to happen, so you don't actually need to watch.
You've seen enough snippets to know that these are the things that I've
definitely seen all the key scenes, either in remakes or parodies or otherwise. But.
So in this montage analogy, which I think is actually a good one, I think you look at last year. Sort of, I think Cedent split into a couple different camps. Some win, it is what it is, I'm just the chubby one. And others who went like montage workout mode and are sort of coming into this renewal season with like abs, right? Yeah. If this is the character arc we're gonna take our cedents on. But I think as we look forward into what this means for the future, is I think you're seeing a bit of a divergence of the cedents who are prepared and are doing things differently and are performing better in the market, which will benefit them not only in the hard market, but as the market conditions shift, will continue to benefit them. And the others who are now becoming aware of, okay, the expectation is shifting.
I think partly because it is actually a race now.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like before it was, hey, everybody, let's all meet on or near the 1st of January.
Yeah.
And you'll all get a medal.
Yeah.
And now it's become like, there's no prize for coming second. You've really got to actually turn up and make sure you're there when the start gun is fired, and run your best race if you want to finish with a good time. Otherwise, in the same way that your time increases, your price is going to increase if you haven't put the time into and the investment into getting good data before you go out to renewals.
Yeah, and I think you're still seeing the importance of relationships and all of that in the market. That's something we've always talked about, being critical. But it's so clear now that the clarity and the accuracy of data is going to be the thing that continues to differentiate. And relationships certainly help, but if the book doesn't sort of tell the story that it needs to tell and the data doesn't support that, that's the name of the game at this point in the renewal season. And I think we're starting to see terms solidify, and we're starting to see deals getting over the line already. But it certainly doesn't feel like it'll be as sort of 31st of December, midnight is looming kind of deals like we saw previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, if we reflect back on some of the findings of the white paper that I produced, if you haven't read it already, make sure to check it out. It's still on our website, I believe.
Yeah. If I point at the screen and say the link is here, will Cordy add a button of some sort? I see this on the...
It's like he's given a very non-committal head gesture there.
I'm just getting a raging head shake. He's like, absolutely not. You cannot demand buttons. Yeah. But I can ask for buttons.
You can ask nicely. Just use your imagination, listeners. Yeah, but if we think on some of the reflections there, one of the ones that stood out for me was that over the past sort of, let's say, decade, is it roughly, of softer market conditions leading up until last year's 1/1, where there was a rather furious pivot in the other direction, we'd had reinsurance underwriters collectively having less and less faith in the submission packs and the information that they were given, and relying more on sort of larger scale portfolio assumptions about how an entire cohort of clients might perform, rather than deciding based on individual accounts. because I just didn't trust, except for a handful of clients, that they were keen to put the effort in to make a difference on, or for clients that made it easy for them to do so. They were just sort of going, well, I don't believe what you're giving me, so you're just getting this scary other price. I wonder whether the market at this point has done enough in response to last year's renewals to re-encourage some case-by-case underwriting or not. Obviously, there's quite a few clients out there using the latest and greatest reinsurance technology to get their data looking good, to get those submission packs prepared in advance and sooner, and using up-to-date information and not, already 6-month-old information by the time they go to market. But as a reinsurer, probably still in the mindset a little bit of, unless you make it really easy for me, I'm going to be working off my whole portfolio assumptions. Maybe a handful, the best clients, the clients that bring me really good data, I'm going to take the time to actually think, okay, I can price you on your own merits.
Yeah, you're going to have to earn that, and I think that will be the case. I feel that will be the case for a while to come, because I think we've seen an increased wariness of cat losses and aggregates that sort of we were talking to the E2 Value team in a previous episode, but whether areas that were sort of relatively consistent and stable will remain so or not. And if that's not the case, you have to then start broadening your sort of portfolio-wide assumptions and underwriting on that basis, because it's harder to look at individual books unless that individual client gives you the quality and clarity of data that sort of justifies different treatment. And maybe at a certain scale, you'll have it where enough clients in the market are providing that it's therefore easy just to then return to a case-by-case basis, and enough automation can exist where you can understand and ingest that data and return your view on that risk more effectively and efficiently. But that's certainly not going to be the case in the immediate term for a number of cedents until we get a bigger push for that data access. But again, this will be led by the reinsurers. I think the cedents will begin to respond and do the things that give them the best chance with those markets, and the reinsurers are becoming very clear and being very vocal about what they're expecting to deliver the prices that the clients might want.
And putting your broker hat on, do you think any sort of cedent and broker teams would have decided that it's safe enough to start playing with any historical structures or changing things? They've got time to try different structures, or do you think it will have been stick to what we know, keep it the same as last year, keep it comparable?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one as we do sort of a recap of 1/1, sort of how many structures moved. I think you'll still see a little bit of working around target spend, which might still be as the market sort of, we're trying to find where it's landing in a hard market sort of tone, if that's moving up the tower a little bit more, if the cedents are buying a bit higher than they previously have, or introducing other elements to help offset the expense that the reinsurer might have. So, more generous commission terms or similar. So I think you'll still have some of that until we feel like we've hit a stability point. And I don't think the message that I'm hearing anyway, and we'll see what the rest of the market's saying, but I don't think we've quite hit like, here's the pricing. I think there's still, it feels like it's moving a little bit still.
Yeah. I just had a thought actually to ask you another question with your broker hat on. Okay, because I realised, partly because of this awesome green background for those of you watching on the video, we've just had our Spotify Wrapped kind of stats come out for the year, and actually, I can't remember the number, something like 85% roughly of our listeners
to us.
Of our listeners.
Oh, I thought of all podcast listeners listen to us. I was like, amazing.
No.
I wouldn't even be surprised.
Well, that's more like 75%.
Yeah, exactly.
85% of our listeners started listening to the podcast this year or something like that. Yeah, Cordy's giving me a thumbs up. Yeah. Which means that many of them possibly would have listened to the later episodes, but not necessarily gone back into the archives of the Reinsurance podcast.
You're missing out.
To listen to, like how the life of a reinsurance broker works, etc. Could you just walk through, maybe for some of our newer listeners or those who aren't familiar with it, what are you doing as a reinsurance broker during these final bits of 1/1? Because we've had all the ambassadorial conversations before, the relationship maintenance and building throughout the year, possibly claims if any happen during the year, and then finally in these past few weeks, you've probably, hopefully,
Yeah.
done all your quoting, etc. What's happening in these final few stages?
So there'll be a few things happening. If you've got your quotes that you're sort of you've got a number of quotes back, hopefully by now, and you're trying to fill out the rest of that panel, the rest of that syndication of the market list. So really pushing hard that the price that you convinced your client was the correct price is the right price to get everything cleared. So you're running around with those now firm order terms, trying to fill out the program. If you've priced it well and you've sort of gotten the right sort of position there, that's working out in your favor. If you've gone out with a desk quote, i.e. the brokers sort of help the client decide what they think that price should be on the structure, similar behavior, and you're really hoping you've gotten that number correct. But right now it's having all those conversations and going out with the client, or sometimes just by yourself now, with the terms, with the data, saying to each reinsurer, here's what we're looking at, here's the data, here's why you should provide the same signing as last year or write this deal for the first time, given all this. You're really working on that narrative and pitching that story into the market. So that's happening at pace right now.
And to give you the mirror view,
yeah,
on the underwriter side, you get all of these submissions. I mean, it's probably changed a bunch.
You're sitting with your arms crossed in a big chair somewhere.
Much like now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I hope that this is more digital nowadays, but simultaneously digitally and physically on the Lloyd's box, we would get just this giant slurry, is that a good word, of submissions coming our way. But it would start a lot like is it Tetris? There's another one that's similar to Tetris. I think it's Tetris. You know, like the pieces just sort of drift down Tetris, slowly, and then and more come. There's a few games like this, but the idea of like a gradually approaching moment of being completely overwhelmed comes towards you. So it starts with like, the first submission packs arrive, and you've got loads of time when the first submission packs arrive. So you read it properly and you look at it, and you actually have time to do the data properly and to double check it and to make sure you're doing it right. And then suddenly, instead of one arriving an hour later or a day later, two arrive. And then after the same interval of time, it like continues to exponentially grow. It'd be like, 6 arrived the next time. And then a bit later, it's like, we had 15 arrive today. And it just keeps on coming. So I think we used to do like 300 accounts, and about 200 of them were 1-1s. So literally in a 3 or 4 week period, we'd have 200 accounts to get through. And the service, I mean, somebody said this in the white paper as well, but the service level received by the clients who gave us their submission packs first versus the ones who brought it to us later on, I mean, was completely night and day, because we were just swimming in binders that we had to remove and, data files that took 3 hours to download, and we'd just be trying to get through it all. And understandably, there would come to a point where we'd have to say, well, let's just not bother with that one.
I think this is one of the more important things between the cedents and the brokers on their collaboration up front is it has to be a scenario where you're able to get the data in such a quality state that when you're going back and forth with your broker, finessing what the messaging is and the structure might be and how that data impacts that structure, the faster you're able to do that, the better you're able to be one of the first people in the market, which is beneficial in any market, not to mention in a hard market. So certainly you're seeing those cedents who were able to do that earlier, got the treatment, they got a bit better of a deep dive into what their book is doing, and there wasn't the scramble as they kind of got looked at. So I certainly think you'll see those firms benefiting more. But this is part one of always a two-parter, the sort of renewal build-up, and we'll do the renewal recap here in a couple more weeks' time, as we sort of take a step back and look at what actually happened, what did the market sort of feel, what was the shakeout of it. But it feels there's less panic. I feel like people are going to have a Christmas maybe this year or something, where last year it was sort of like, well, forget the holidays, folks. We're going to be here till the very last seconds, where this year it feels orderly. It feels that people are kind of prepared. They're braced for those uncertainties.
At least orderly in comparison.
Yeah, exactly.
Listening to this being like,
he's been at the office till 2 a.m. for the last week, and it's just...
If I hadn't had the Reinsurance podcast on to keep me company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But hopefully you, dear listener, are enjoying your 1/1 renewal season and excitedly awaiting our renewal recap.
Indeed.
But until then, or until our episode between those two, see you next time.
See you then.
Thanks, everyone.
Dun, dun, dun.